Psalm 27 says, Yahweh is my light and my salvation. So why should I be afraid? Yahweh is my fortress, protecting me from danger. So why should I tremble? When evil people come to devour me, when my enemies and foes attack me, they will stumble and fall. Though a mighty army surrounds me, my heart will not be afraid. Even if I am attacked, I will remain confident. The one thing I ask of Yahweh, the thing I seek most, is to live in the house of Yahweh all the days of my life, delighting in Yahweh's perfections and meditating in his temple. For he will conceal me there when troubles come. He will hide me in his sanctuary. He will place me out of reach on a high rock. Then I will hold my head high above my enemies who surround me. At his sanctuary, I will offer sacrifices with shouts of joy, singing and praising Yahweh with music. Hear me as I pray, O Yahweh, be merciful and answer me. My heart has heard you say, come and talk with me. And my heart responds, Yahweh, I'm coming. Do not turn your back on me. Do not reject your servant in anger. You have always been my helper. Don't leave me now. Don't abandon me, O Elohim of my salvation. Even if my father and mother abandon me, Yahweh will hold me close. Teach me how to live, O Yahweh. Lead me along the right path, for my enemies are waiting for me. Do not let me fall into their hands, for they accuse me of things I've never done. With every breath, they threaten me with violence. Yet I am confident I will see Yahweh's goodness while I am here in the land of the living. Wait patiently for Yahweh. Be brave and courageous. Yes, wait patiently for Yahweh. In Deuteronomy 17, we have an interesting passage of scripture. It's a passage that is actually directed towards not every individual member of the house of Israel, but rather it's directed to the leadership and specifically to the king. And because what's good for the king, in principle, is something that should also be good for the king's subjects, I'd like to just briefly turn there. And that's Deuteronomy 17 and verse 14. It says, you are about to enter the land Yahweh your Elohim is giving you. When you take it over and settle there, you may think we should select the king to rule over us like the other nations around us. If this happens, be sure to select as king the man Yahweh your Elohim chooses. You must appoint a fellow Israelite. He may not be a foreigner. The king must not build up a large stable of horses for himself or send his people to Egypt to buy horses, for Yahweh has told you, you must never return to Egypt. The king must not take many wives for himself because they will turn his heart away from Yahweh. And he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth and silver and gold for himself. When he sits on the throne as king, he must copy for himself this body of instruction on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. He must always keep that copy with him and read it daily as long as he lives. That way, he will learn to fear Yahweh his Elohim by obeying all the terms of these instructions and decrees. This regular reading will prevent him from becoming proud and acting as if he is above his fellow citizens. It will also prevent him from turning away from these commands in the smallest way. And it will ensure that he and his descendants will reign for many generations in Israel. In Deuteronomy 17, if you boil it down in this section, this passage from verses 14 to 20, if you boil it down to its essence, you're going to note three guiding principles by which the king of Israel was to live and that he was to exemplify for his subjects. As the chief citizen of the nation, the king was to set the example for the nation so that its citizens would also seek to strive by the highest ideals, or strive for, rather, the highest ideals established by Almighty Yahweh, not only for their individual betterment, but for the stability and health of the entire community and nation. The king was to set the example, and the people were to follow. The three guiding principles that you would see here, if you boil it down to its essence, are these three. Number one, know who you are. Number two, know in whom you trust. And number three, know what you believe. Know who you are, know in whom you trust, and know what you believe. With today's message, I'd like to focus, since we don't have time to look at all three of those in a deep sort of way, I'd like to focus on the first of these, which is to know who you are. The Day of Trumpets is a solemn day of reflection. It's a day of clamor. It's a day of supplication. The Day of Trumpets is, in effect, a national day of prayer, as the blast of the trumpet symbolizes the shout or clamor of the people to Almighty Yahweh, seeking his guidance and seeking his face. So the day of prayer that this day represents, the Day of Trumpets, it's a day also of announcement. Announcement of what? Announcement of our loyalty and faithfulness to the King, an announcement that the King is soon to return. It's reflective of that coming blast, similar to what you find in 1 Thessalonians 4, when Yahshua returns with the sound of the trumpet blast. It's meant to elicit the incident at at Sinai, when Moses brought the Torah to Israel. It's not commemorating that day per se, because that's during Feast of Weeks time, but the message and the environment, the atmosphere is similar to that. It's day of declaration, of declaring yourself as before Yahweh's presence and declaring your trust and your loyalty in him. And as such, this is a day that begins a count towards the remaining days in the 7th month, towards the sacred season, the high points of the sacred season, beginning with the Day of Trumpets, and then next in 9 additional days on the 10th day of the 7th month, the Day of Atonement, which has a significance all its own. And then 5 days after that, through the 22nd day, the Feast of Tabernacles, which has an immense significance of its own as well. And we won't get to any of that today. But the Day of Trumpets begins that count. And traditionally, in Judaism, this 9-day period between the first day of the 7th month and the Day of Atonement represents a period of reflection and of introspection, similar to what we do just prior to the days of unleavened bread. So as we reflect on our lives, as we reflect on our integrity, this is a good day to know who you are. Who are you? In what do you find your ultimate identity? And notice that I say ultimate identity, because there is an identity that you're living, but it may not be your ultimate one. And that's what we're going to examine today. We're going to use incidents and examples from the life and reign of King David. And I've done something similar like this before, because I love to use David's life, which I believe is there in the scriptures, as an example to us, as a model for how we should be and how we should not be. So we're going to look at some incidents and examples from the life and reign of King David to illustrate how we can further define and live by this guiding principle of knowing who you are. And specifically, I want to examine what it means to live in your identity versus living in your destiny. So the title of the message today is Identity versus Destiny. They're not the same thing necessarily. Identity versus destiny. Knowing who you are means living according to your destiny in Yahweh. And the word destiny, of course, is directly related to the term destination. And when you choose a particular pathway, you are going along a destination from here to there. So if you're living according to your destiny in Yahweh, you're living according to the destination that Yahweh has put in your path, in your arc of life, if you will. And we're going to talk a little bit about arc in the sense of storytelling, as by means of illustration. So knowing who you are means living according to your destiny in Yahweh, as compared to the identity that you may have fallen into over time thus far, because of choices that perhaps were not fully consistent with what or who you truly are in terms of your destiny or destination in Yahweh. There was a man by the name of Joseph Campbell. Some of you may have heard of him. Joseph Campbell was an interesting person. He's dead now, but he's famous for a number of things. But one of the main things is his elaboration with regard to storytelling about something that he termed the hero's journey. And some of you may be familiar with that, particularly if you're creatives. The hero's journey is something that we're all familiar with because we see it not only in the books that we read, but we also see it in the movies that we watch, in the short stories that we read, in the short movies that we watch. We see it also in the songs that are sung in popular music. We see it even to a degree in artwork, in terms of paintings and sculpture and the like. It's implicit in there if it's not fully expressed. And what is the hero's journey? And it's most often referred to in the course of story, whether it's a novel or a screenplay. But in every story, you have a hero who is known as the protagonist. And that hero is often pitted against what's known as the antagonist. Sometimes it's a villain, sometimes not. But the hero or protagonist begins every story living in what you would call the status quo, right? When you say that someone's in their status quo, it's just kind of the same humdrum everyday existence that they're used to, without anything upsetting the apple cart, so to speak. So to say that you're just living with the status quo means that you kind of like things as they are. You don't like to shake things up. And living in the status quo is very safe, but it doesn't really get you anywhere because it's stagnant. It keeps you stagnant. And if you know anything about stagnation, not only does stagnation keep you from getting from here to there, but it also causes you to just kind of sit there passively. As a matter of fact, if you look at a body of water, what does a stagnant body of water look like? Where there's no running water. It's dead, right? It starts to stink after a while because all it is just collecting bugs and moss and whatever else is in the air, right? And at some point, it doesn't move. It's nothing. It turns a sickly color. There's no life in it. There's nothing flowing. And our lives can get that way too. So in the story, the hero begins every story living in their status quo. In other words, the life that they've always known. And then through some opportunity that is presented to them early on in the story, they catch a glimpse of something that you might call their essence. Their essence. What is that? Their essence is what we'll refer to as their destiny. In other words, they're here in their status quo. It's the way that they're living operationally. That's the way they're operating in the day-to-day. But there's something more that they're meant for. And that's their essence. That's something more is their essence, which we'll refer to as destiny. So sometime very early in the story, they catch a glimpse of their essence, but only for a moment. It's elusive. It's out there, but it's not within reach. Or it is within reach, but they don't recognize it. And then what usually happens is that there's some inciting incident that propels them forward, that moves them forward towards a visible goal, which then becomes the main point of the story. Will they reach that goal or not? So if you think, for example, of a very well-known story that most of you probably know, the story of Star Wars, you have Luke Skywalker, who is the hero, right? Luke Skywalker is the protagonist or the hero of that story. So his hero's journey begins with him on a desert planet called Tatooine. And he's just a farmer. That's the status quo. He's just doing his thing every day with his crops and all the chores he has to do on the farm, right? And it seems like that's just kind of what he's going to be doing all the rest, for the rest of his life. But if you know the story, he has dreams, doesn't he? His father had been a pilot. And we find out later, much more than a pilot. But at that point, all he knows is that he was a pilot. And he longs to have some of the adventure that his father had of the stories that he had been told. But all he's doing is longing for that adventure. In no way, shape, or form does he think that that has anything to do with him. How could he possibly, right? That's not who he is. He's a farmer. And all he is stuck on this rock. But he feels the pull. He feels something calling him to be more than what he's living at the moment. And then, of course, he has an encounter that puts him on the pathway towards finding something greater about himself. So he has that visible goal that eventually has to do with this rebellion, right? And going and rescuing this princess. So is he gonna, and then there's a larger goal of him eventually becoming a Jedi, right? But is that ultimately what it's all about? Is it really about rescuing the princess or about becoming a Jedi? Well, not actually, right? Because there's something deeper. There's something in him, in his character, that he's meant to bring out. So you have that outer goal that can be defined, yet at the same time, there's something happening on a deeper level. In other words, there's an inner goal, an inner outcome that is also coming into focus, though under the surface. And the rest of the story is simply a description of that journey, or the arc, what's called the arc, that this character takes, pushing their way through conflict and barriers. Because if you don't have conflict and barriers, you don't have a story, right? If you have two people, if you have a movie, what you see, all you see is two people talking to each other back and forth, that's not a movie. That's just a conversation that's been filmed, right? It's just a dialogue. But when you start adding conflict in there, then you have at least the beginnings of a story if it's done right. So they push their way through conflicts and barriers in order to reach their goal, or not, because not every story ends with the protagonist reaching their goal, but a lot do. But what's ultimately really at stake is not the outer goal, it's the inner thing. It's that destiny that remains so elusive to them. And I can give you half a dozen examples, but I think you get the point based on the Star Wars example. And that inner thing is usually related, and hear me carefully, is usually related to a deep fear, perhaps the deepest of fears. In other words, to get what they ultimately want, they will inevitably, it's a must, or the story is not worth its salt. And if you see a story like that, you may not be able to quite put your finger on what went wrong, but it leaves you flat. You walk out of the theater or you walk away from your television wondering, what is it that I just watched? What did I waste 2 hours of my life on, right? If it doesn't have this. So that inner thing is usually related to the deepest of fears. So in other words, to get what they ultimately want, they will inevitably have to face that thing that they fear most in life. Because the payoff on the other side, painful as it may be to get there, is the achievement of their destiny, who or what they were placed on this earth to do. And when you've experienced that, you know that you've had a good time. Because what you've done in that story, in that book, in that movie, is you have vicariously lived through them. It has become possible for you to achieve your innermost desires because you've just achieved it through them. And you know what? Your brain doesn't really know the difference between the person on the page or the person on the screen achieving that goal, facing similar obstacles to you that you do. Your brain doesn't really know the difference between that person experiencing it and you experiencing it, because it's happening to you because you're living the dream along with them, you see. And that's why we love stories so much, because story is metaphor. It's the stuff of great stories, yes, but more importantly, it is everyone's story. What I've just described, it is your story. It is life. And that is why we love stories so much, because story is metaphor for life. That's why we love scripture so much, because Yahweh, in all the different ways he could have presented us, he could have just presented a series, a manual, a bunch of instructions, but he didn't. He presented his plan of salvation. He presented the ways in which we should live in story format through David, through Joshua, through the apostles, through the apostle Paul, through the prophets, through the patriarchs. Matter of fact, the whole beginning of the scriptures, the whole first 50 chapters is story after story of the patriarchs, and we living the story along with them. And it's a story told very well, exceptionally well, in fact, as stories went in the ancient world. And this is why it appeals to us so much, because story is a mechanism by which we can propel ourselves forward. But let's focus on the hero and the beginning of their story. In the beginning of their story, they're living in their identity. The hero begins the story living in his or her identity, not destiny. There's an identity that they've created for themselves. What does it consist of? a lot of things, but it consists mainly by scripting, scripting, as if you're writing a script, scripting from all walks of life, scripting received from parents, from uncles and aunts and brothers and sisters and teachers and authority figures and media and movies and all the stuff that you consume into your mind and heart. And some of that scripting is very good, and other scripting not so much. And we're a collection. Each one of us is a collection of all that scripting. And we begin our walk with Yahweh within that identity, following inclinations and tendencies that are not necessarily in our best interests. In other words, we tend to live, again, operationally. What does it mean to live operationally? It means the way that you're kind of living every day, the way you're operating every day. We're living operationally from that perspective, the perspective of all that scripting, but not necessarily from what's in your core. And that's why sometimes we're so unhappy or unfulfilled, because we think that we're living our destiny and we're just living an identity that we've created for ourselves based on all the scripting. And the reason that we're unhappy or unfulfilled is because a lot of the time we're living operationally because that's what we've become accustomed to, but we are not living what Almighty Yahweh made us to be deep down. This is, by the way, one of the challenges for parenting. So those of you who are parents or have been parents know exactly what I speak. And those of you right now who have young children, of whom I could think of a few among you, if you look at something like Proverbs 22:6, it shows that this challenge extends not only to your own desire to live your destiny, but for you to try to help your children to do the same. It's a very deep concern for parents. So if you look at Proverbs 22:6, it says, direct your children onto the right path, and when they are older, they will not leave it. And there's a lot encompassed in that. It's every parent's challenge to do what? To observe. Always be observing, always be watching your children, to observe, to sense, because it takes some perception, and to identify the bent, B-E-N-T, the bent of that child. In other words, which way are they bending? Towards what are they bending? So it's every parent's challenge to identify the bent of that child, to detect it and to nurture it, to identify that bent and the quest in the child's formative years to help lead that young mind towards the life that will be most fulfilling for them, based on what Yahweh appears to have naturally placed in their hearts and minds. What do I mean? Example, you watch your child, and your child is constantly drawing things, maybe very crude, crude drawings, stick figures, right? Barely, maybe, but they're drawing. And then as they get older, they start getting better, and they're constantly drawing. And then, in their teen years, they're drawing incredible pencil drawings. And then what do you do as they get older? Well, you try to give them as many opportunities to create as you possibly can, right? And a lot of times when parents don't realize this, they start orienting kids in ways in which it's not really their bent. And then, you don't need to be wasting your time drawing. Here, working these math examples instead, because you're not going to be an artist, you're going to be an accountant, right? Because that's where the money is. And then we have all kinds of issues later on in life because the person winds up in a career that was never theirs to begin with. But that's another sermon, right? But one of the challenges of the parent is to help them to find what it is that Yahweh's placed in their hearts naturally as their ultimate destiny. But we forget these things in terms of what it is that's really in our heart. And when we're children, if we're not nurtured properly ourselves at that time, we don't come into a full understanding of what that ultimate destiny is. We forget. And if we were blessed to even know those things to begin with, we forget. Most people, I would dare say, based on coaching so many people, most people, I would dare say, do not even have a clue of their true essence or destiny. Some of us go entire lifetimes not truly knowing, because we're so caught up in the heat of the day-to-day, and we're steeped in the scripting and the programming that has come to us through many sources, some well-meaning and with good intentions, and others not so much. So there are many things that we can talk about regarding identity versus destiny, but what I think I'd like to do is concentrate on two characteristics of which we must be especially aware both of which are key destroyers of finding and living out our destiny as Yahweh meant for us. And they are these. One, what are our inclinations? What are we inclined towards? What is our bent? It's not too late to figure it out, even if we're no longer children. We just got to work a little harder at it. What are our inclinations? And two, what are our fears? If you understand your inclinations, your bent, and you understand your fears, you can take action regarding both those things in order to know your destiny. And ultimately, we're looking at a destiny in Yahweh, right? Because it's what he put you on this earth to do. So let's talk about the first one, knowing your inclinations. So your inclinations or your tendencies, your bent, your proclivities, are a lot of terms you can use for it. That's important to know, not only for the positives, but perhaps especially for the negatives, because you have positive inclinations and negative inclinations. For example, if you're a man and you know that you have an inclination, a tendency, a weakness for women in a way that is not proper in accordance with scripture, that's good information. That's useful information. So rather than kick yourself about it, work with it. Don't allow yourself, for example, to get into situations in which you can become compromised. It's important to know that and not lie to yourself. If you're inclined towards alcohol, the same thing. If you're inclined towards alcohol, why are you taking a route home from work where you know you're going to go by that liquor store? If you're a woman who knows that you have a tendency towards materialism, stay away from situations in which you can spend money indiscriminately. And why do you have 3 credit cards with $5,000 limits on each one? And we can do this for both men and women, right? I'm trying to pick on both equally. We can go through a whole bunch of things and we will all include ourselves in these, right? Because we all have inclinations in which we could go. And having that information is useful because it helps us to make better decisions in Yahweh. In fact, had David understood his tendencies, and what we're doing in the next few minutes is we're going to look at a king. Because in Deuteronomy 17, the king was supposed to be an example for his subjects. And David, before he was king and after he was king, provided some very interesting examples for us to consider as we work on our own identity versus destiny. Had David understood his tendencies, he might have made very different decisions. So let's start out before he became king. Let's take a look at 1 Samuel 17 for just a few minutes. We'll start reading with verse 20. 1 Samuel 17, verse 20. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning. Now, this is David before he even went into Saul's court, right? So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Remember that David was sent, and we didn't see this because I'm starting a little bit later in the chapter, but David is sent to bring some food and some supplies to his brothers. So he arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. Have you seen the giant? The men asked. He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. Note that. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes. Not a bad deal. David asked the soldier standing nearby, what will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living Elohim? Notice just a bit of inconsistency here, a little bit of conflict. And I'll come back to that. And these men gave David the same reply. They said, yes, that is someone must have told him, and these men gave David the same reply. They said, yes, that is the reward for killing him. But when David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, he was angry. What are you doing around here anyway? He demanded. What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? We'll come back to that in a second. But notice, David asks, he doesn't just say, if he had said, who is this pagan? And how come someone doesn't shut his mouth? If he had just said that, which is part of what he said, his motive would have been clear. But that wasn't the first question he asked, was it? First question was, what will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Right? I mean, he's a young man, right? He's entitled to make a name for himself or try to earn something for himself. But it's kind of interesting that his character is such at this early age that his immediate inclination is not, what do we do about this guy? But his immediate inclination is, what's going to be done for this guy? For this guy, right? Now, what we do about this guy, it's what will be done for this guy. It's interesting. Like I said, it's not like anything sinful in that or anything. It's just revealing. It's revealing. It says something about his character that he's even going in that direction first. What will be done for the man? Does that perhaps indicate a proclivity, a tendency, an inclination towards greed, maybe? Towards wanting what he wants when he wants it? Don't know. We'll see. But I'm also going to point this out. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But when his brother comes to him and he says, what are you doing around here anyway? What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle. What have I done now? David replied. I was only asking a question. Okay. He walks over to some others and asks them the same thing and received the same answer. Then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. So what question was he asking? About the reward again, perhaps? Right? So he's asking several people about the reward. But the interesting thing I want to point out here is Eliab's, his brother, brothers tend to be that way, right? They tend to be very brusque, and then they're not interested in your future, your destiny, because they're not thinking about that. They don't see that. Because in the same way that a prophet is not recognized in his own country, a person is not typically recognized in their own family either, right? How many famous people are out there that within their family, they ain't so famous because everybody knows everything about them, right? They have that contempt. And it's interesting how he lays this contempt on David. Look at that. What are you even doing here? What happened to those few sheep that you're supposed to be taking care of? It's interesting because those few sheep are closer to David's ultimate destiny than getting a reward for ending the Philistine. And it's interesting that right from the very beginning, David's destiny is trivialized by someone. Just like your destiny is probably trivialized by someone too. What do you mean that you're going to do that? You're little such and such from, your little Karlos from Brooklyn. What do you mean you want to, really? Never going to happen. What has it been for you? How have they trivialized your ultimate destiny? And for all of us, even our destiny in Yahweh. Priests and kings, wow. What are you all in, a J.R.R. Tolkien novel? Right? Disney? People don't recognize that, kings and priests. And yet we're royalty. All of humankind is, but they don't recognize it. Sermon for another day. But notice that David is not really paying attention to his destiny. And in fact, hearing his brother, the scripting continues, right? Hearing his brother belittling his actions with the sheep, the very thing that's going to catapult him into stardom, the very thing that brings him into Saul's court, watching those sheep, the very thing that teaches David how to be a king is the very thing that's belittled from the very beginning. Just keep that in mind. Let's go over to 1 Samuel 18, beginning with just a chapter over, beginning with verse 22. So now he's in Saul's court. Then Saul told his men to say to David, the king really likes you, and so do we. Why don't you accept the king's offer and become his son-in-law? And of course, this is after he's killed the giant. When Saul's men said these things to David, he replied, how can a poor man from a humble family afford the bride price for the daughter of a king? When Saul's men reported this back to the king, he told them, tell David that all I want for the bride price is 100 Philistine foreskins. Is that all you want? Vengeance on my enemies is all I really want. But what Saul had in mind was that David would be killed in the fight. David was delighted to accept the offer. Before the time limit expired, he and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. Then David fulfilled the king's requirement by presenting all these foreskins to him. So Saul gave his daughter Michal to David to be his wife. Okay, but again, this also references David's mission to kill Philistines for Saul's daughter. In other words, it's sort of like saying, I'll accept if the price is right, right? And the price was right. And then he got the daughter. He's pleased to be in the royal court. David is, he's you can see that there's something going on here that is almost like it's heady business for him. Is it going to his head? Is he a mercenary? Is he cultivating a habit of giving to get? He's going down a path operationally that's training him. That's training him, not in his destiny. By the time he's here at Saul's court, he's moving away from the shepherd boy, right? It was the shepherd boy, the humility of heart, the one that's described in the Psalms later. It's the shepherd boy that Yahweh called to Samuel. But this mercenary type that he's going to go and he's going to get a bride for a price. And he's going to go and he's going to, how can a poor man from a humble family afford the bride price for the daughter of a king? And then, like hint, hint, Saul, I need something, give to get. He's cultivating a habit here. You see, that's how deep-seated problems develop. That's how we start to cultivate identities rather than destinies. Things like compulsions, addictions, or simply certain basic life or base lifestyles. It all starts with a particular tendency towards something illicit or something that's not at all in your best interest. Eventually, that simple, supposedly harmless tendency leads to a habit, which then ultimately leads to a full-blown way of life, otherwise known as an identity. What's your identity today? And where did it come from? Do you know? It's worth sitting and thinking about, reflecting upon. And if that identity is inconsistent with who you know deep inside that Yahweh put you on this earth to be, then it's time to start working on that. Wasn't it David's inclinations, his attitudes, his general way of thinking that he exercised since youth that eventually led David to big trouble? He eventually developed a mindset that I will simply go get what I want, take what I want when I want it. Now, I realize that it may seem like a big stretch from this to that, but that's how it usually happens. It starts out with an innocent thought. It starts out with a little habit. It starts out with, what is the price for this? What am I going to get if I do this? And then it eventually translates into something much bigger down the line as you start to get and as you start to cultivate that habit. In other words, he developed and nurtured an entitlement mentality by which he trained himself to elevate himself above the law over his fellow citizens. I'm talking much later, right? How did he do that? Well, we see that when he went and took Bathsheba. All of a sudden, he was above the law. The law that applied to everyone else all of a sudden didn't apply to him. That didn't come out of nowhere. You don't just pop out the story of David and Bathsheba and somehow think that this came out of, well, it was an aberration. And some people will tell the story that way. They'll think, oh, David was the perfect man. And well, he had this one little aberration. No. The incident with Bathsheba didn't begin on David's roof, my friends. The incident with Bathsheba began many years before, as he cultivated a habit in which I am entitled to this or to that. Because that was an identity that he had cultivated. He trained himself to elevate himself above the law over his fellow citizens, the very thing which he was supposed to avoid, according to Deuteronomy 17. It became a pattern with him of developing and nurturing a greedy and demanding spirit. Not convinced? Want to see that a little bit more? Let's look at 1 Samuel 25, beginning at verse 39. 1 Samuel 25, 39. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, praise Yahweh, who has avenged the insult I received from Nabal and has kept me from doing it myself. Nabal has received the punishment for his sin. Then David sent messengers to Abigail to ask her to become his wife. When the messengers arrived at Carmel, they told Abigail, David has sent us to take you back to marry him. Now, we didn't see the rest of the story, but it's just kind of interesting that David is starting to accumulate wives for himself. He just says, when the messengers arrived at Carmel, they told Abigail, David has sent us to take you back to marry him. There's not a lot of discussion there, right? He sent us to take you. Now, she went willingly because, she was respectful and she probably loved David, just a little bit that she knew about him, but she had been Nabal's wife. And of course, he had this encounter with her and she saved Nabal and his household and it impressed David. But it's interesting. He just, hey, go get this woman to become my wife. Verse 43, David also married Ahinoam from Jezreel, making both of them his wives. Okay, let's go to 2 Samuel 3. By the way, I'm going to go to 2 Samuel 3, but I just want to go very quickly over to Deuteronomy 17, where we started. Now, of course, you're going to have the naysayers, the scholars who are going to butcher the text, and they're going to say, well, Deuteronomy 17, a lot of the book of Deuteronomy was probably written way after David or whatever. You're going to have that kind of stuff, and I'm not going to buy into that nonsense. Deuteronomy 17, beginning with verse 17, the king must not take many wives for himself because they will turn his heart away from Yahweh, and he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth in silver and gold for himself. And then there's other things that he's supposed to do as well. So what is David doing as he's starting to come into royalty, into his formal royalty, period of royalty? What is he doing, accumulating wives to himself? 2 Samuel 3, verse 14. David then sent this message to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, give me back my wife Michal, for I bought her with the lives of 100 Philistines. So Ishbosheth took Michal away from her husband Palti, son of Laish. Now we are, I skipped the verse before, but while David was away, fleeing from Saul, his wife had been given to someone else. Obviously, that was problematic, right? That never should have been done to David. So you might say, well, David was entitled to get his wife back. Yeah, the only problem with that is that it's very evident from the text that David didn't really love this woman. And he essentially did it because, well, she's mine and I'm getting her back, and it doesn't matter how I'm going to treat her. And by the way, never mind that I had these other wives here as well, right? And we know that their relationship was not good because we're told so. I'm not going to go turn to it now, but when you read the description of the relationship between David and Michal, there's not a whole lot of love lost between them. Let's put it that way. So what is he doing, getting this woman just to have her stuck in the house, just to say, I got my wife back? Sorry. I didn't mean to be so emphatic there. What is he doing that for? What was the point? Well, the point was, she's mine. I want her back. Doesn't matter if I'm not going to, have any kind of happy relationship with her. I want her back, period. In the meantime, she's happily married. Ishbosheth took Michal away from her husband Palti, son of Laish. Palti followed along behind her as far as Bahurim, weeping as he went. Then Abner told him, go back home. So Palti returned. Now, say what you will about Michal and Palti, but it seems pretty clear to me that Palti was going to miss his wife. David, on the other hand, well, I'll leave you to fill in the blanks. What about 2 Samuel 5, verse 13? After moving from Hebron to Jerusalem, David married more concubines and wives, and they had more sons and daughters. Well, those are just political marriages. Yeah, let's go with that. And he tells you all the different sons that were born to these concubines and wives, right? What is he doing? What is he doing? It's not at all in the spirit of Deuteronomy. It's a disturbing trend. It's a disturbing trend that he's cultivating. It's not about sex. That's not what I'm getting at here. It's the demanding spirit. It's the demanding spirit. It's not even about the polygamy. It's the, I want what I want and I'm going to get it. And I can because I'm king now, you see. And then it continues with Bathsheba. That's what it eventually leads to. That's the ultimate crowning achievement in a very negative sense, right? By the way, others before him, others before David had become accustomed to taking. Eli's sons, remember Eli's sons? Samuel grew up with, under Eli was as his father, and Eli's sons were priests in name only. They're the ones who would go to the pots where the sacrifices were being boiled, and they would just grab them out of the pots, big chunks of them, to go and have parties. And then we're told later that Samuel's sons went along the same direction. That's why he couldn't have a successor. That's why Samuel was really the last judge, because his sons were not walking in the right way. Saul, we know Saul took what he wanted, right? So you figure that surely David's going to break the chain. Surely David's not supposed to be this way, but he follows right along the same pathway. He's joined a bad club. He's joined a bad club. Let's look at the culmination of this over in 2 Samuel 11, which is where things really start to fall apart for David. So it says, in the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. He sent someone to find out who she was, and he was told. Okay, and I'm going to summarize the rest of the story for lack of time, but I'm going to point something out here. We all know the rest of the story. He sends her Bathsheba. She comes to him, and he has relations with her, and then he sends her back. And then David sends for Joab, and then he sends word to get Uriah, her husband, to take him and put him in the front lines. Now, by the way, just a reminder who Uriah was. So just hold your place in 2 Samuel 11 and go to 2 Samuel 23, verse 1. 2 Samuel 23, verse 1. These are the last words of David. David, the son of Jesse, speaks. David, the man who was raised up so high. David, the man anointed by the Elohim of Jacob. David, the sweet psalmist of Israel. And then verse 39. So David is talking here. And let's read also, before we read verse 39, let's read 18. 2 Samuel 23, 18. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, the brother of Joab, was the leader of the 30. Who are the 30? That's interesting. He once used his spear to kill 300 enemy warriors in a single battle. Those warriors among you, I'm sure that brings up your adrenaline, right? It was by such feats that he became as famous as the 3. Abishai was the most famous of the 30 and was their commander, though he was not one of the 3. And then it starts describing a bunch of these warriors. And then down it says, 22, deeds like these made Benaiah as famous as the 3 mightiest warriors. He was more honored than the other members of the 30, though he was not one of the 3. And David made him captain of his bodyguard. Other members of the 30 included, and then there's a whole list of them, right? So these 30 were, and the 3 apparently, right, for sure. But the 30 were the mighty men, what they were called the mighty men. They were warriors. They were 30 of David's most trusted, loyal, faithful, dedicated guards and soldiers. Who's the last one on the list? Look at verse 39. Uriah the Hittite. There were 37 in all. Each one of them incredibly faithful, each one of them, and we could find other passages that describe them and their exploits. So Uriah wasn't just some random soldier out in the field. Uriah was one of the mighty men. He was one of the 30. So that explains, as you see Uriah's attitudes towards David, David is sending him, hey, go home and be with your wife, right? He's, of course, trying to cover up his own misdeed, right? And Uriah says, how can I go home and enjoy my wife when your soldiers, your men are out in the field and I can't do it? I mean, it's like heaps of coal upon this man's head, no? And yet he still went through with this plan. But look at some of I want you to note, because we didn't read through the whole thing, but I want you to note the occurrence of the words and variations of the words sent and take throughout this passage. Verse 1, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. So he orders Joab and the guys out to fight. Verse 3, when he finds out about Bathsheba, he sent someone to find out who she was, and he was told she's Bathsheba. Now, in and of itself, it's just language, right? But just notice the tone, right? He sent people. And then verse 4, then David sent messengers to get her. And when she came to the palace, he slept with her. And then down in verse 6, then David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. So Joab sent him to David. And then he's used to ordering people, right? He's the king, sure. But this pattern of send, take, send me the Uriah the Hittite. Verse 15, he tells Joab, the letter instructed Joab, station Uriah on the front lines, send Uriah on the front lines. Put him out in the front. Verse 27, when the period of mourning was over, after Uriah was dead, David sent for her and brought her to the palace, just like he did with Abigail. And she became one of his wives. It's this pattern of send, take, send, take. Notice throughout the emphasis on this, what we could interpret as a demanding spirit. He sends, he takes, they obey. This is, what is my point? This is operationally who David presents himself to be. This is how David shows up in the world. It's not how he grew up. He grew up offering, in a sense, potentially offering his life for his sheep. This is a different David with a different spirit. That's why the account of Nathan the prophet, when he comes to him in chapter 12, is so poignant, because he gives him the story about a lamb, right? In other words, the rich man owned many sheep and cattle over in 12, and you don't have to turn there. And he owned nothing but one little lamb that he had bought. David had been one who had taken care of many sheep and presumably little lambs. And David is incensed to find out what this guy does in killing that one lamb. But yet, what has he turned into? What has he turned into? This is not David. This is not who David really is. This is operationally who David presents himself to be, but not who, that's an identity, but not who he is really deep down. This is not what his destiny is supposed to be. How do I know this? Because throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel and the book of Psalms, we see the other David, the David who was kind, the David who was humble, the David who was generous and accommodating. Go to Psalm 51 and read that slowly. And the repentance, the level of repentance after the situation with Bathsheba, and read other passages where he describes how sick he feels, that his body is like his bones are breaking from the guilt that the man feels. Because deep down, he wasn't this. It's as if there's a constant battle between the man who he wants to be versus the man who he has allowed himself to become. Why? Maybe because of fear. Maybe because of giving into circumstances and surroundings. Maybe because he believed the garbage scripting from his brothers and others who put him down. Even when they sent, when Samuel was sent to Saul, his own father, right? Not to Saul, excuse me, to Jesse. He says, "Hey, bring me your sons." And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do you have no other sons? Samuel's baffled. Well, there's the younger one, but he's just he's a young guy out the sheep. Even his own father treats him as inferior to all his hulking brothers, right? It's interesting. So when you consider all these things, it's very easy to see how this man's identity had become one where he didn't really truly know himself. So you got to know your inclinations and from where they arise, but you also need to know your fears. What is it that was motivating David to stay in his identity? Well, in part, it was his fears. Let's go to 1 Samuel 21 and look at this other aspect. 1 Samuel 21, beginning with verse 10. So he's on the run from Saul. So David escaped from Saul and went to King Achish of Gath. Gath? King Achish of Gath? That's the Philistine army. That was the army that he had defeated. But the officers of Achish were unhappy about his being there. Yeah, I'll say. Isn't this David, the king of the land? They asked. Isn't he the one the people honors with dances, singing Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s? David heard these comments and was very afraid of what King Achish of Gath might do to him. Yeah, I'll say. So he pretended to be insane. Quick thinking, David. Scratching on doors and drooling down his beard. Finally, King Achish said to his men, "Must you bring me a madman? We already have enough of them around here. Why should I let someone like this be my guest?" And then into chapter 22. So David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Soon his brothers and all his other relatives joined him there. So he goes and he escapes. He leaves Gath. He escapes to the cave of Adullam, and his brothers and his relatives join him there. So David is before Achish, and he has to act crazy, right? What in the world was he doing there in the first place? And in verse 12, it says that he was very afraid. He's paralyzed by great fear among the Philistines. He had forgotten how Yahweh had always delivered him. And I had preached another sermon, I don't know if maybe you remember, where when he was fleeing from Saul, just a few verses before, he relies on not on the ephod, which is the priestly garment that was used to it was the garment that was used to not garment per se, but an implement that was used to by the priest to inquire of Yahweh. Instead, he relies on Goliath's sword. This is 1 Samuel 21:8. David asked Ahimelech, do you have a spear? Or Ahimelech is the priest. Do you have a spear or sword? The king's business was so urgent that I didn't even have time to grab a weapon. So he's lying to the priest. I only have the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, the priest replied. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. Take that if you want it, for there is nothing else here. So instead of choosing his destiny and consulting from the ephod, consulting the priest about Yahweh's will with the ephod, instead he goes and gets the sword of his enemy, thinking that the sword is what's going to help him. That's him relying on his identity and not on his destiny. And what's driving so much of it? Well, we see in these next few verses, right? It's fear. What causes him to lie to the priest? It's fear, right? And I'm not standing here condemning David. I'm empathizing with him because I do the same thing under much less trying and stressful circumstances, I can assure you. What about you? Do you make decisions, bad decisions out of fear? Do you neglect your destiny in Yahweh out of fear or anxiety? I bet you do. I know I do. And so did David. He had forgotten how Yahweh had always delivered him from the mouth of the bear and from the lion. And then back to 1 Samuel 22, verse 2. Then others began coming, men who were in trouble or in debt or who were just discontented, until David was the captain of about 400 men. So he's starting to build up his army, right? This is before he became king. Later, David went to Mitzpah in Moab, where he asked the king, please allow my father and mother to live here with you until I know what Elohim is going to do for me. He's starting to go in the right direction there, right? Until I know what Elohim is going to do for me. See, it's peaking out his reliance on Yahweh, but he's not quite there yet. How do I know that? Because he's still there. So David's parents, what do I mean by that? He's still there. Let's keep reading, you'll see. So David's parents stayed in Moab with the king during the entire time David was living in his stronghold. He's living in his stronghold. One day the prophet Gad told David, and here's the heart of it, leave the stronghold and return to the land of Judah. Leave the stronghold and return to the land of Judah. So David went to the forest of Hereth. At least to his credit, David left. What am I getting at? Leave the stronghold. What is a stronghold? A stronghold is kind of like a safe house, right? Except this thing was a whole cave dwelling. But he says to him, David, in essence, what are you doing here? This is not where your destiny lies. This is a stronghold. It's safer for sure. It's certain. It's secure. It's very comfortable and cozy in comparison to what lies in wait for you out there. But your destiny does not lie in the comfortable and the safe. That's not where you're meant to be. And by the way, none of you either. What stronghold have you created for yourself that is preventing you from being the best that Yahweh has made you to be? David was a warrior. David was a warrior king. That's not necessarily you, right? You're not necessarily a warrior king. Some of you may be, but most of you here have other destinies. What is it for you? And what is the stronghold that you have created that's preventing you from getting there? And in verse 5, Gad confronts him. He says, go back to Judah. What are you doing here? You have a destiny to fulfill. You're not going to do it in the security and safety of this cave. Are there risks? Yes, of course. But that's a necessary part of the journey. As Joseph Campbell would have told you, with the conflicts and the barriers in the way of the protagonist, you have to go through them. And you know what? You have to face your worst fears to go through them. What does Luke Skywalker have to do? He has to face Darth Vader. He has to face the enemy head on, right? Because his arc doesn't actually end in the first movie. His arc goes through at least until the third, until he has to face the very thing that he's afraid of. And it's even worse because he finds out that it's his father, right? There's so much going on there. I can't even begin to unpack it, but it's the primal fear. He has to face that which he's afraid of. In the end of the first movie, he has to confront the reliance on his eyes and his senses, right? So he's the only one that can destroy this Death Star. And he hears the voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi telling him, close your eyes, right? He says, use the Force. I don't remember if he actually says to him to close his eyes, but he definitely says to use the Force. And he closes his eyes and he stops relying on his senses. That's a fearful moment because it's the last chance to do anything. He's about to get shot down. Well, if it weren't for Han Solo, that's another story. But he has a moment there. And at that moment, it's do or die. And he has to face it. Am I going to believe in this? Am I going to trust in this? Or am I going to fail? Am I going to just rely? Am I going to go back to what's comfortable? It's comfortable to just use your eyes all the time, right? And to have all the machines do the work for you. Not so comfortable to close your eyes and to rely on that Force, right? In this context, of course. What is that for you? What is it uncomfortable? What is it that you need to do that's uncomfortable for you? It's easier to go back to what's comfortable all the time. Sure it is. There's no risk in that, or very little. But that is a necessary part of the journey. So knowing your inclination, knowing your fears, when you get a grip on those things and you take a good, hard, honest look at those things, you can go a long way towards making the changes in your life. So here are 5 quick solutions as I bring this to a close of things that you can keep in mind as you're working on moving towards your destiny in Yahweh. Number 1, be honest and active in continually identifying your inclinations and tendencies. Be honest and active in continually identifying your inclinations and tendencies. It does you no good to continue to lie to yourself if you have been, and most of us do. Most of us rarely say what's really on our minds. Most of us really act in ways that are not seeking to cover up what's really within us. So if you can do that in an honest, genuine way, identify those inclinations and tendencies, you will be able to identify barriers that you're allowing yourself to fall into. That's mixing metaphors. Barriers that you're allowing to yourself to put up. Then you could deal with them. Number 2, nobody does it alone, right? Enlist resources and allies to help you do this. No one does it alone. Enlist resources and allies. Who do you have around you that can help you? David had Gad. David had his mighty men. David had others along the way who were friends. He had Jonathan initially before Jonathan was killed. So who can you enlist on your side? Who is on your side? What resources and allies do you have to help you in your journey? Enlist them. Number 3, for negative tendencies specifically, take steps to kill the monster before it gets big enough to eat the city, not after. Right? You watch any monster movie, they wait too long, right? And of course, the scriptwriter has them wait too long, otherwise there'd be no movie. But they wait too long to deal with the monster. You got to kill it while it's little. Once it grows to a certain point, then it's a matter of containment at that point and possibly defeat. So when you recognize those things in you that are going in the wrong direction, kill it before it has a chance to get out of whack. You think of Cain and the story of Cain and Abel, and Yahweh says to Cain, "Why is your face fallen? Why are you in a bad mood? Don't you know that you have that sin is crouching at the door?" It's very interesting, the Hebrew construction there. Sin is crouching at the door. It's like an animal waiting to pounce. It's there, ready to jump. And it desires to overcome you, but you must master it. It's where the Jews get the idea of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination that every human being seems to have, right? And even call it an evil inclination, right? What evil inclinations are out there? Maybe they're not necessarily evil, but they're not benign either. What are the inclinations that are seeking to pounce on you and take over your life? And I'm just not just talking about obvious types of things like desire for sex or desire for money or whatever. I'm talking about anything that is causing you to not think clearly, to move towards your destination. What is it that's trying to overcome you and overtake you? It says, but you must master it, he said to Cain. And he didn't master it. And we all know the end result of that. So for negative tendencies, take steps to kill that monster before it gets big enough to eat the city. Number 4, and this is interesting, understand that while fear is not a good thing, fear is also partly how we grow. It's not a cause for paralysis. Rather, it is a cause for learning, for stretching, for growth, and how to do things better moving forward. So instead of trying to resist fear, if you resist fear, it's like trying to push down a beach ball in water. You ever tried to do that? And the harder you push it down, the more resistance it goes going up, right? So instead of trying to push that thing down, find a way to work with it. Instead of trying to push fear out of the way, understand that fear is part of the game. Fear is part of the journey. Luke Skywalker was afraid, but he went ahead and he did it anyway. And in every story worth its salt, the protagonist is almost always afraid, right? Except maybe James Bond movies, which are, more like comics than they are reality, right? But in most genuine like stories, the protagonist is afraid. That's part of the point. Of course, they're going to be afraid. It's a primal fear. They're facing their fears. But it's not cause for you to shut down and to passively accept life as it comes at you. Rather, it's a cause to learn. This didn't work. Okay, I won't do that again. Let me try this. This didn't work in that relationship. Let me change my tactics and try this in the relationship instead. Okay, being nasty with someone didn't work. Let me try to be nice. Being proud didn't work. Let me try to be humble. Thinking that I know everything didn't work. Let me show some humility. And on and on. Stretching. Thinking that you can't do something, do it anyway. And if you fall on your face, okay, try not to fall too big. But understand that falling is part of the game. Get up, dust yourself off, and keep moving forward. If you sin and you fall, dust yourself off and try it again. I think I've heard that somewhere. I think I've read that somewhere. Growth. Fear helps you to grow because it causes you to take charge and take action. So a little bit of fear is a good thing because it causes you to do things in a different way, in a more innovative way, or in ways in which you had not thought about before. And it helps you to do things better moving forward. So understand that it's part of the deal. And finally, number 5, it's so important, especially when things are going wrong, quote unquote wrong. Maybe it's not going wrong. Maybe you just have to learn that lesson. Maybe it's going right and you just don't know it yet. Don't assume automatically that it's going wrong. Wrong is overrated. Remember that on the other side, this is number 5. Remember that on the other side of fear lies victory. On the other side of fear lies victory. David knew it, and that's why even though he was afraid, he did, to his credit, leave the stronghold. And he did go out there and he did become king. And you know what? Some of his fears came true. But you know what? He did it anyway. And he lived to a ripe old age, mistakes and all. He lived into his 80s, mistakes and all. He was a righteous king and the model of a messianic figure. Because he understood that fear is here, but victory is just around the bend. And you read the Psalms and you see that. But he knew that it didn't just come from him, right? That victory comes from following the one who knows the end from the beginning. That's the main reason why we can continue forward. Because victory, the person who serves Yahweh knows that victory ultimately comes from following the one who knows the end from the beginning. You don't need a physical prophet to tell you that. You don't need God to come and tell you. You have the prophecy of the living word of Yahweh to remind you at every turn. So remember that on the other side of fear lies victory. So on this day of trumpets, my friends, please remember that we have a destiny. For each one of us, it is decreed by Almighty Yahweh to be a specific thing or collection of things, right? But it's something that's unique to you. But we all have a collective destiny to be kings and priests in the presence of Almighty Yahweh. So let's use this day to think about those things, to reflect on them, to be encouraged, and let's continue moving ahead. Let's go to Psalm 23 to close. This pretty succinctly describes David's journey, right? Yahweh is my shepherd. I have all that I need. He lets me rest in green meadows. He leads me beside peaceful streams. He renews my strength. He guides me along right paths, bringing honor to his name. Even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect and comfort me. You prepare feasts for me in the presence of my enemies. You honor me by anointing my head with oil. My cup overflows with blessings. Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will live in the house of Yahweh forever. Thank you, Almighty Yahweh, for your word, for the encouragement that it provides. Thank you for examples like David, because even through the things that he did that were displeasing to you, you use those examples to teach us, Father Yahweh. So we're encouraged by your word. And we know that just like David, there are parts of us that are also displeasing to you, and yet you always, with your grace and mercy and compassion, help us to overcome them and to continue pressing ahead to fulfill the destiny that you have for each of us, Father. Not only our individual destinies, but our collective destiny, to be your image bearers on this earth, glorifying you and reflecting that glory throughout the earth. So may we live up to that vocation, Father Yahweh. And may we do so with gratitude and joy and hope in our hearts. In Yahshua's name we thank you and pray. Amen.